Hello, and welcome to part two of my review of single-family property assessments in York, Maine. In this video, I will explain how land value calculation is done. If you go to the assessor's website, you will find a document called Understanding Your Assessment, and in that there's a paragraph which attempts to explain how the calculation is done for pricing land in York. The terms that are listed are important to understand, and there's a base price, and it's for residential and commercial properties. There's a site index multiplier, an index factor, size adjustment, a condition factor, a street index, a neighborhood code multiplier, and lot size. And it attempts to show you how the calculation is done here, but it really isn't that clear. And in fact, there's no real explanation of what these factors are and where the numbers come from. So, one of the things they do say, though, is that they use vision appraisal software to calculate land value, and they do that to get precise assessments assuring equity and fairness. And we'll touch on this later to see if it really is leading to equity and fairness. But you won't get enough information out of this to try to understand how your individual land is calculated. And that's my goal in this presentation, is to give you a better feel for how to do this yourself. The calculation begins with a land curve, which is shown here. It's not a linear line, it's a curve, and it shows where an acre of land is set at $70,500, and from there you see the different lot sizes and what the prices would be. And it's not easy to compare your property to somebody else's property directly, because, for example, if you did and you had a 0.2 acre lot and you expected your neighbor who has a 0.4 acre lot to be them to have, say, double the value, then it's totally wrong, because it doesn't work that way. And in fact, another way to look at it is to look at the price per acre for a given lot size, and you see it's just, again, it's a power curve. Somebody with a tenth of an acre, if you calculated the per acre price, it's like almost $5 million compared to the 1 acre lot, which is 70,500. So it doesn't make sense to compare your land to your neighbor directly. You need to go through the calculation. And there are several factors that were mentioned on the previous slide, and they're used as multipliers from the price obtained on the curve. So you start with the curve and then you start applying these factors. And the factors are as follows: a neighborhood adjustment factor, which they call the street index on the other slide, which is specific to the neighborhood. So every neighborhood has its own adjustment factor. There's a condition factor, which I'm not exactly sure how this is done, but it's usually a 1. There's an influence factor, which is site index specific. So depending on what site index your property is listed as, you will have a different factor to use. There's, of course, the acreage of your lot, and there's something I call the assessor fudge factor, which is after the whole calculation is done, the assessor reserves the right to adjust that in any way that he sees necessary. What drives the land value in York? What I've indicated on this slide is a theoretical neighborhood XXX, which is abutting the ocean on the right, but as you go west, it's more and more inland, so that the site indexes indicated by the numbers actually increase as you get closer to the ocean. And 9 would be a property right on the ocean, nothing obstructing. 8 would be maybe a property which can see the ocean, but at any time somebody could build a house in front of you and you'd lose your view. And 7 is, I would say, these are homes that are near the ocean but don't have a view of the ocean. So obviously, as you go from left to right, the property or the land value is going to increase. And that's shown here. Let me get my laser. Okay, so in this example, neighborhood 100 with a half acre of land you see how the price of that half acre increases if you had a site index 5 to 9. Okay, so it goes up in a pretty dramatic way, and that's happening because of the influence factor. So each site index read across has a number, and in the case of 5, it's 1. In the case of 6, 1.5, and so forth. And in fact, if you did the math here, you'd see that's a 1.5 times increase going from 5 to 6. So the site index has a big influence on what you will pay for your land depending on what site index you're in. If we look at the other main factor for driving land value, it's actually what neighborhood you live in. Every neighborhood has an adjustment factor. These numbers have been determined at some point, and apparently they do get reviewed once in a while, but it's not clear to me how these are chosen, but they are there, and that's what they use. So you see as you go, and I've put this in increasing order, as you go down the list of neighborhoods, you see the land value is increasing. So for one site index, it keeps getting larger. So from 100 to 135, you see almost a 75% increase, say. So what you see going across is due to the site index. What you see going down has to do with the neighborhood adjustment factor. There's also an additional tweaking of the numbers, as I alluded to on the previous slide, and it's called feathering. This is what I call the fudge factor. So maybe within this site index 7, there's a reason to believe that as you get further away, things are not as desirable. So the assessor will apply this factor. It might be a 0.9 or 0.8 to adjust the numbers, adjust these numbers, which are calculated, down even further to account for differences in value. Okay, let's get into the details of the actual calculation. This calculation is done by a company's software called, I guess, Vision Appraisal software, but it can easily be programmed into Excel to do the same calculation, and that's what I did here. So if I walk through the calculations in this Excel spreadsheet, you will get an understanding of how it's actually done by the software. So again, you need to, put in 135 as the neighborhood, acreage is 0.2, site index 6. So first you will interpolate between these 2 points and come up with a price. So for 0.2 acres, you come up and you read 57,967. And so that price is for 0.2 acres, and then you convert it to an acre price, which is just take this number, divide by that number. There's an influence factor, as we mentioned on the previous slide, that's 1.5 for site index 6. And then you calculate something called an initial unit price, which is this influence factor times the 70,500, which is designated for 1 acre on the land price curve. Now you calculate what's called the new land price. That is the influence factor times the acre price. Okay, so you get this 434,750. You then come up with a new influence factor, which is 4.11. That is the new land price divided by the initial unit price. Okay, so this divided by this is 4.11. There's this fudge factor, which I mentioned is the feathering. I leave it at 1 for this example. Then we come up with something called the total adjustment. This is calculated by taking the new influence factor times the fudge factor times the neighborhood adjustment factor. And as I mentioned before, for neighborhood 135, this is a 6. So when you multiply all those numbers, you get a 24.67 is the total adjustment. And then the land value is just take that total adjustment times the initial unit times the acreage, and lo and behold, that is your land value, and that's with no adjustment by the assessor. This is just what the computer spits out in the software. Okay, let's do a sanity check and see if what this calculation is doing is fair and equitable. So I've reproduced that same table on this slide along with a map of the various neighborhoods. So for example, neighborhood 100 is situated in sort of the center of the Nubble here, close to the Nubble Lighthouse and my favorite, Dunn's ice cream. Neighborhood 105 listed here is a little bit probably more of a view of the ocean. You kind of just look across the street. 136 is this small neighborhood right over here, which is kind of a neat little neighborhood, very close to the water, walking distance to the center of Long Sands Beach, the bathhouse. You could easily walk to the Nubble and the Short Sands. 110 is right on the ocean. This is, the prime location facing south over the ocean on the rocks. Where are we? 130 is on the ocean. It's across the street, but it's on the ocean of the entire length of Long Sands Beach. And 135 is this interesting neighborhood down here, which is actually separated into two parts. There's this part down here south of neighborhood 161, and then there's the rest of it, which runs, it's a lot similar to 136 in that it's in one neighborhood, and you've got properties which have views of the ocean and some which are along the school with no view of the ocean. In orange, I indicated what each one of these neighborhoods might have or does have in terms of site indices. So 100 has got 5 through 8, so does 130. 105 has got 6 through 8, so does 135. 136 is just 6 and 7s, and 110 is just 8s and 9s. Makes sense, it's right on the ocean. Okay, but what seems anomalous to me is the fact that 135 ends up being the most expensive land of all of those neighborhoods. So including ocean property, and including neighborhoods which are very close to the center of Long Sands Beach. So this struck me as very odd. Probably you could argue not equitable. Why should the people on 135 who are actually on the south end of the beach, um, mostly rocks over here, there are no lifeguards over here, but they've got the longest walk if they care to walk 2.5 miles or so to Nubble or to the Short Sand. So it just struck me as odd that 135's land, based on the calculation coming out of that software, would be this way. And so I leave it to you to decide whether that's fair. Okay, here are the reference tables. If you care to do some calculating on your own, feel free. The reference tables include the neighborhood descriptions, the code and the description, and the adjustment factors in 3 different columns. The site index influence factors are listed here. So whatever your site index is, this is the influence factor that you would use. Okay, last 2 slides. I just give you a quick look at a Google map showing neighborhood 136 relative to neighborhood 130 in the ocean and the various sites that we talked about in York, like the Nubble Lighthouse or Short Sands. And those are the streets and how many homes are on each street. Here is a Google map showing neighborhood 135, also just in from 130 with the various streets that are present and the number of homes that are on those streets. And again, it's the southernmost tip of Long Sands. Well, that's all. I hope you now understand how your land is calculated in York. Maybe you can play around and see if you can come up with the same number that's listed on your property card. But again, if you have any feedback, please put it in the comments. Thank you very much.